Welcome, friends, to our Wednesday meditation and talk. This webcast is on my Facebook and YouTube pages and IMCW's as well. So we'll begin with our meditation, and you might invite yourself into presence, taking some moments to find your way to the position that allows you to be most relaxed, most alert, and then settling in. Welcome, my friends, to our class. And this meditation is a little bit of a different format than some you might be familiar with. First, we'll just set ourselves. You might find a comfortable way of sitting, settling. You might close your eyes. And you'll find that through this meditation, I'll be asking you a kind of repeating question. So you can explore that as we go. For now, you might start by taking a nice, full, deep breath. And with the out breath, letting go, letting go. And breathing naturally, scanning the body and noticing if there's any obvious areas of tension or tightness. And taking a few moments to just let go wherever you feel holding. Be sure to soften in the shoulders and relax the hands. And softening the belly, relaxing your heart. Can you imagine the space between your eyes? Can you imagine the space that fills the nostrils? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the lips? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the tongue? Can you imagine the space that fills the whole mouth? Tongue, gums, teeth, lips. Can you imagine the space that fills the brain? Letting the throat fill the neck. Can you imagine the space that fills the neck? Can you imagine the distance between your shoulders? And can you imagine and sense the space that fills the shoulders? Can you imagine the length and the volume of your arms? Can you imagine the space that fills your thumb? Can you imagine the space that fills the forefinger? And can you imagine and sense the space between the thumb and the forefinger? Can you imagine the space that fills the middle finger? Can you imagine the space that fills the ring finger? And can you imagine the space that fills the little finger, the pinky? Can you imagine the space that fills all the fingers, the space between? Can you imagine the space between the palms and the back of the hands? Can you imagine the space that fills the whole hands? Can you imagine the space that fills the heart? Can you imagine the distance between either side of the chest? Can you imagine the distance between the breastbone and the spine? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the whole cavity of the chest? Can you imagine the distance between the sides of your waist? Can you imagine the distance between the belly button and the spine? And can you imagine the space that fills the whole abdominal cavity? Can you imagine the length and the volume of your legs? Can you imagine the space that fills the feet? Can you imagine and sense the space that fills the whole body? Can you imagine the interior space out of which all the sensations are arising? Can you imagine the space that extends out from your right side beyond the most distant stars? Can you imagine the space that extends from the left side out beyond the most distant stars? Can you imagine the space in front of you extending out beyond the most distant stars? And can you imagine the space behind you extending out beyond the most distant stars? Can you imagine the space in front of you and behind you extending out beyond the most distant stars? Below you, extending out beyond the most distant stars? And can you imagine the space above you extending out beyond the most distant stars? And can you imagine that the vastness of outer space and the vastness of inner space are continuous space? Can you imagine that this continuous space is filled with the light of awareness? Can you imagine that this continuous awake space is the space of your being? Can you imagine that everything arises and is part of this awake space of being? Can you imagine that everything belongs? Sensations, feelings, sounds, thoughts, in this awake, boundless space of being. Can you imagine that this awake space of being holds with tenderness all that arises within it? Can you imagine resting in the space of your being? Resting and allowing whatever arises to be held with tenderness and care. Can you imagine that everything that's arising right now, sensations, feelings, sounds, thoughts, are arising like waves in the great sea of formless, tender awareness? Can you imagine that everything that's arising is witnessed held in tenderness, like an ocean cradling the waves. Bringing yourself back, taking some moments to stand or stretch, and we'll begin the announcements for this coming week. As always, please check tarabrach.com for my virtual offerings. And please check imcw.org for live stream offerings made available by our local teachers. The affinity group this coming week is for women. And each week I invite your offerings, your generosity, which is the word dana in Pali. We give all the talks and meditations freely and are very much supported by whatever you offer. So thank you in advance. And the links can be found in the description. Okay, in a few moments, we'll begin this week's shared reflections. Namaste and welcome. When I first started practicing meditation, it was 1973. The view from the mainstream world was that meditation was really something very esoteric, mysterious, otherworldly. I'd like to share a story that was told at the first meditation retreat I attended. And in this story, a woman in her 50s told her travel agent that she wanted to go to India. And her travel agent was thinking, well, why don't you go to Miami like you normally do? But she went ahead and made the reservations. And first, the woman had to take this bus when she flew into India across, probably about 6 hours of driving. And on the bus, she told somebody where she was going. And she said, oh, that's at that place, you can only, she said she was going to go see the guru. You can only speak 3 words. And the woman said, I know, I know. So then she gets off the bus, takes a long train ride, again, runs into people that knew this guru and reminded her that you can only speak 3 words. Finally, she's, takes the final Jeep ride from the train station over to the encampment where the guru is with many disciples holding court, and gets in the long line to speak to the guru. Again, attendants remind her of the rules, the 3 words, and she knows it. Finally, it's her turn, and she goes into this open tent where the guru is with his saffron robes and his wispy beard. And she looks him in the eye and she says, Sheldon, come home. This is one of the early stories. And I've always loved it because now, in contrast to when I started practice in our contemporary society, uh, meditation's pretty household type word, pretty accessible. Science has shown a lot about it, so people are more comfortable with it. But here's the thing. there's still for many a sense that deep spiritual realization is something that only happens to other people, to mystics or to people from other times or those who live in monasteries in Asia, or maybe a bit for ourselves, but way down the road. And it's interesting if you sense how you imagine your own path. Often it's literally like a path from here to some far off destination, some future time and place. And there's this sense that we're this small, separate self on our way somewhere. We're trying to get somewhere else, experience something that's not here. And here's what we miss, which is that the only place where we can find what we seek, where we can find love, presence, freedom, peace, the only place is right here, right now. What we're seeking is the awareness that's looking out through these eyes and the awareness that's listening. What we're seeking is that tender heart space that, of course, gets blocked, but is always and already here. So, in a deep way, what we're seeking is what we truly are. It's our own true nature. And we take ourselves to be something smaller. We take ourselves to be a limited self where something's missing, something's wrong. There's a wonderful poet, Wei Wu Wai, who says, "Why are you unhappy? Because 99.9% of everything you do is for yourself, and there isn't one." So the most radical, liberating teachings present in Buddhism and all the non-dual wisdom traditions are those that support us in realizing who and what we are beyond a separate and limited self, beyond that illusion of a separate self. I find it really helpful to imagine a boundless sea with changing waves. And these are the waves of our thoughts and our feelings and behaviors. And the teachings remind us that you're not a wave, you're not a set of waves. You're the boundless sea. You're that boundless sea, that formless, awake awareness that includes the changing waves, that expresses through the changing waves. But you're the boundless sea. That's your pure identity. And the understanding is that we're never separated from this formless awareness. Might get blocked, but we're, in terms of what we're perceiving, but we're never separated from it any more than a wave can be separated from the sea. And in moments of realizing that belonging, that sense of being the ocean, including the waves, the felt experience is love. Everything is part of us. We belong with everything. And here's the thing to remember, that even at the times we feel most stuck, most contracted, most blocked, we're actually never alienated from that intrinsic loving awareness. And this is true for all of us, no matter how wounded or neurotic or whatever. It's the truth that that awake awareness really is what animates our life. Okay, so this is really where the hope is, that our potential is to awaken beyond the limiting narrative we have about who we are, and to realize that formless presence. And as we do, what comes with it really is peace, really is happiness. And the Buddha said, I would not have taught you about happiness if it were not possible. So this is what we're going to be focusing on, that the very grounds of happiness and freedom is a shift in identity. It's a shift in identity from that small, separate self to a sense of belonging. And the way it shows itself in a day-to-day manner is a shift from a focus of I to we, you know, and with that, a natural caring towards all living beings because they're a part of us. There are two primary ways that we wake up, that we discover or realize the truth of who we are. And again, if you think of it in terms of an ocean or sea with waves, the first way of waking up is that we actually pay attention to that great, vast, boundless awareness. We sense awareness is here. We sense that that wakefulness is really what we are, that formless essence. And that allows us to then, as I mentioned, cherish all beings. So one way is direct attention to awareness itself. And the second pathway is bringing our attention to the waves that are arising, the pleasant ones, the beauty, and the suffering. And in paying attention to the ways, we discover they're made of ocean, that that's really what we are. And there's an art to knowing what to attend to when. And we each have to customize. It's often a kind of back forth flow, but we each have to customize. And there are some general principles that help me. And the first is that if your mind is busy, if you're feeling emotionally reactive, if there's charged waves like anxiety or fear, anger, blame, judgment, it's wise to first pay attention to the waves. They're what asking for attention. And if in those moments you try instead to look towards awareness, you'll either get frustrated and blocked, or you might have what's called premature transcendence, which is actually a kind of avoidance of feeling and trying to open to something larger. But what happens is that the awareness is disembodied. It doesn't have the fullness, the richness of pure awareness. So the guidance is really start where you are. And if the waves are strong, then pay attention to the waves. And so that's how we'll be starting with this exploration we're doing together. And it'll be an exploration in several parts over several talks. And so we begin with how do we pay attention to the waves of what are arising in us in a way that really awakens us from that sense of separate self, that reveals the ocean, the awake awareness, the loving presence that's our deepest nature. The signal to pay attention to the waves is usually discontent, restlessness, some form of suffering. And it might be slight or it might be more severe, that it's a sense of not okay. Something's missing, something's wrong. And sometimes it's really gripping, as in when we're gripped by fear or jealousy or anger. Sometimes the signal is just obsessive thinking, or it might be numbness with an undercurrent of anxiety. But something lets us know, oh, okay, there are waves going on and there's some identification with them. Whenever you're suffering, the message is that you're living in too small an identity. I think of often like the caterpillar in a cocoon, that we're meant to keep growing, enlarging our sense of who we are. And when we get caught in the egoic self and preoccupied with the egoic self, the fears and the wants, it's like an arrested development where it's part of what naturally unfolds for us humans. And we're meant to keep growing. And when we don't keep growing, then it's that feeling of a cocoon, like we're caught in something. And you might even notice that you can sense in that this kind of intuitive experience of there's something more, there's a larger space to live in. Here's a poem by the poet Tukaram that I really find delightful. I was meditating with my cat the other day, and all of a sudden she shouted, "What happened?" I knew exactly what she meant, but encouraged her to say more, feeling that if she got it all out on the table, she would sleep better that night. So I responded, "Tell me more, dear." And she soulfully meowed, "Well, I was mingled with the sky. I was comets whizzing here and there. I was suns and heat. Hell, I was galaxies. But now look, I am landlocked in fur." To this, I said, "I know exactly what you mean." What to say about conversation between mystics? So landlocked in fur. And and it happens, when we're caught tossed in the waves and reactive in that separate sense of self. So that's when we start right where we are and deepen attention and bring those waves of experience into the light of awareness. So we'll look at that, how we do that, and we'll focus on first the waves of thoughts and then the waves of emotion, and how with each we can wake up to a larger sense of our being. So incessant thinking. There's one master who was asked to describe the world, and his response was lost in thought. And we know it. We spend so much time in a virtual reality and lose contact with our senses. You might just think about today and sense the kind of swaths of time that you're thinking versus being here in a kind of wakeful, present way. This is Carlos Castaneda. He writes, "You talk to yourself too much. You're not unique in that. Every one of us does. We maintain our world with our inner dialogue. A man or woman of knowledge is aware that the world will change completely as soon as they stop talking to themselves." Our ongoing thoughts, our beliefs actually fuel a trance of not just a separate self, but a deficient self, a threatened self. And as we know, anxiety, uh, anxious worry, planning, figuring out, these are primary survival tools of our ego. We're very addicted to them and they lock us in. This came to mind a lot when we had our dog Hakuna, Jonathan's dog. Hakuna is this royal standard poodle, and I would take him walking a lot. And it was a lot of, he just was so happy. He'd go around, sniffing everything, his tail wagging. And then now and then the Akitas that also lived in the neighborhood would appear. And of course, I started feeling dread because I'd have to wrap his leash around the tree and hold on. He weighed more than me, and he would get ferocious and growl and tug and bark, and then they'd be out of sight, and abruptly it was all over. And he'd go back to being fine again, sniffing and wagging his tail and enjoying everything. And I think about how with humans, we would have kept fueling the fight with stories in our mind. Those damn Akitas, who do they think they are? The nerve, they're in my neighborhood. Can't trust them for anything. They'll do it again. I'm going to teach them a lesson. We could just go on and on with with the battle. Him, it was history. And we just get hooked. And even when there's nothing particular going on to trigger us, there's a default network in our brain that produces all sorts of thoughts to keep us ready and vigilant, that just keeps on resurrecting that sense of a separate self where something's missing and something's wrong. And of course, the thoughts we most regularly focus on are moi, me. There's that story of a guy in a bar and he's saying, I know I'm nothing, but I'm all I can think about. And unfortunately, these waves of self-centered thinking, how can I get more comfortable? What am I doing wrong? How's this situation going to affect me? They blind us to the larger world. Um, This is Pema Chodron. She says, being preoccupied with ourself, with our self-image, it's like being deaf and blind. It's like standing in the middle of a vast field of wildfire flowers with a black hood over our head. It's like coming upon a tree of singing birds while wearing earplugs. So the challenge of waking up from these thoughts is that we actually take them to be reality. We believe what we're thinking. They shape our entire experience. We live so many moments inside a virtual world. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. I'll share a story. It's kind of an illustrative one. It goes like this. As a bagpiper, I play many gigs. Recently, I was asked by a funeral director to play at a graveside service for a homeless man. He had no family or friends, so the service was to be at the Paupers Cemetery in Kentucky backcountry. As I was not familiar with the backwoods, I got lost, and being a typical guy, I didn't stop for directions. I finally arrived an hour late and saw the funeral guy had evidently gone and the hearse was nowhere in sight. There were only diggers and crew left, and they were eating lunch. I felt badly and apologized to the men for being late. I went to the side of the grave and looked down, and the vault lid was already in place. I didn't know what else to do, so I started to play. The workers put down their lunches and began to gather around. I played out my heart and soul for this man with no family and friends. I played like I've never played before for this homeless man. And as I played Amazing Grace, the workers began to weep. They wept and I wept. We all wept together. When I finished, I packed up my bagpipes and started for the car. Though my head hung low, my heart was full. As I opened the door to my car, I heard one of the workers say, I never seen nothing like that before, and I've been putting in septic tanks for 20 years. Apparently, I'm still lost. It's a man thing. So, illustration that we live in our thoughts, we believe our thoughts, and sometimes they can be good approximations of the world and guide us, and other times not so much. So what do we need in order to wake up out of that uh, addiction of being inside the thought waves and forgetting the ocean? Because that's what's happening. In the moments that you're lost in thought, there's no remembrance of this larger awareness of this heart space that's really home. We're cut off. So the way back home is the power of mindfulness, because in a moment of non-judgmental seeing of the thoughts, where there's an awareness of thinking, then we enlarge and inhabit that awareness, and we have become the ocean that's aware of the waves. So the trick is, can we begin to notice the thoughts so that we become the awareness that's noticing and are no longer confined into the space of the thought? Because this is the shift in identity from lost in thought to inhabiting the ocean. A key practice on the spiritual path, and this runs through many, many traditions, is learning to notice the trance of thinking. One teacher, Punjaji, says just to ask yourself again and again, am I dreaming? Am I inside that virtual reality? It's wonderful if you can wake up from a thought and just bring yourself back to the senses. Let the senses, the feeling and being right here, be a kind of home base so we know when we're off in a virtual process. And when we start practicing regularly mindfulness of thinking, the most profound takeaway is I'm not my thoughts. I don't have to believe my thoughts. It's so easy to take them as real. I like the way one of my teachers, Sokne Rinpoche, puts it. He says, thoughts are real, but not true. They're real events happening in the brain. They have an effect on our body and our heart, but they're not the reality itself, the representations. So this area of waking up to thoughts is a powerful and primary grounds for being able to shift and enlarge our sense of being, moving from being caught inside the thought wave to the sea of awareness. And you might just take a moment, we'll pause here and just do a little practice. Take a few breaths. What I'd like to invite you to do for the next minute or so is to count your thoughts. So just like you're a cat at the mouse hole, and every time a mouse seems to pop its head out, you just count 1, 2, 3. And a thought includes sound bites, images. Okay, let's begin counting thoughts. Now, continuing to pay attention, you might stop counting and just witness. When there's a thought, notice it. After noticing it, just sense the difference between the thought and what's right here. This living reality of sensations, sounds, feelings. You might sense when you've noticed a thought, the inquiry, well, where did this come from? Where does it go to? And you might notice the gap between thoughts. What's that like? The teacher Sri Narsargadatta says that when the mind is momentarily free from its preoccupations, it becomes quiet. If you do not disturb this quiet and stay in it, you find that it is permeated with a light and a love that you have never known, and yet you recognize it at once as your own nature. After Sri Narsargadatta gave that teaching, there was a questioner who asked him, well, how shall I recognize the state when I reach it, the state of quietness, of the gap between thoughts where that light shines through? So he said, how will I recognize that I've reached it? And the response was, and I want to share this with you, he said, there will be no fear. All distinctions between the personal and the universal are no more. So this is the possibility, waking up from thoughts. It's the pathway from the waves to the ocean. And the more you practice it, the stronger that remembrance is, that when you're lost in thoughts, just to come back. The more you have that remembrance, there's just this increasing sense of freedom of what is when we're not hitched to those waves. Now, you might be wondering, yeah, but some of the waves of thoughts are actually creative solutions and they're helpful reminders or they're necessary warnings. And that's absolutely true. And the idea is not to get rid of waves of thought. We couldn't survive without thinking. And yet, when they take over, when they dominate our life, then we're trapped in that limiting cocoon. We're just living in these reactive waves. So the path is to deepen attention and learn the art of waking up from thoughts. So you have discernment as to which ones to pursue. And this includes thoughts that serve the spiritual path. Um, there's a classic Zen story of a new monk practicing and going to the Roshi, the master, and saying, what happens after we die? And the Roshi's response is, I don't know. And that really agitated the young new monk. And he said, but, I thought you were a Zen Roshi. And the response was, I am, but not a dead one. you know, so we can't think our way to freedom. There are some thoughts that support us on the spiritual path, but it's in the moments of waking up past the thought waves that we actually start to trust freedom. Okay, so this is the first domain of working with the waves and coming into the ocean. The second domain is working with waves of emotion. And they include thoughts. They include thoughts that are charged and sticky. It might be thoughts of blame, and they come with the emotion of anger, or thoughts of self-blame and the emotion of shame, or thoughts of worry and then the feelings of fear. The waves that are most intense in your life are the ones that really entrap you, keep you in the cocoon. keep you blocked from feeling the ocean are the ones that represent core beliefs that are rooted in fear. And we all have some because they're installed in imperfect relationship with caregivers and by our culture. And they're ideas of how reality is that we take in a very deep way, including something's wrong with me. I shouldn't be the way I am. I have to be different. I'm unlovable. Others don't see me. I'm unworthy. I can't trust myself, or I can't trust others. I can't trust the world. I need to protect myself. I need to control things. So these are waves of fear beliefs, the thoughts and the feelings. And they're really the foundation of our worldview. Especially when they're dominant, they stir up a range of related emotions. The fear stirs up also anger and shame. And they shape our whole experience of reality. Gandhi famously taught that our thoughts bring on our actions, and our actions create our character, and our character creates our destiny. So we get our whole sense of identity organized around these fear beliefs. And if we don't recognize them, these waves, and awaken from them, they do govern our destiny. They keep us in that cocoon, separate, feeling deficient, feeling threatened. They block us from spiritual wholeness. And by the way, this pertains to society-wide fear beliefs too, the beliefs of us and them, the set of waves of one set of waves dominating another, where valuing some humans over others, or all humans over other animals, perceiving the earth as other, as a source of supplies, not as a living web that we belong to. And in each example I'm giving, again, it's that identity that's small, that's separate from the whole. And then it keeps fueling greed and violence and domination. So if we're to alter the destiny that Gandhi talks about, really of destruction, destroying each other and this living earth, we need a collective shift of identity. We've been talking about opening up our individual identities to the whole. We need a collective shift of identity from us, them, to we, to recognizing our shared belonging to each other and all of life, to valuing all life forms. So again, we turn to how do we train our hearts and minds when we're caught in those waves of strong emotion. And here I speak of RAIN, the acronym RAIN. Many of you are familiar with it, I know, because that's how we practice bringing mindfulness and compassion to the waves where we're stuck. And the fruit of RAIN, which I've called after the rain, this is where we experience that shift in identity, where we can sense the shift from being identified as a small, stuck self back into that sea of awake awareness. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with RAIN, the letters of the acronym stand for recognize, allow, investigate, and nurture. And I'll give you an example of how RAIN is not just a tool for um, soothing difficult emotions. It really is a tool for awakening in the deepest sense from that separation, from that small self, back to wholeness. And the example I want to give you is one friend who I worked with at one of our monthly satsangs online. And she described being traumatized by her family's rejection, feeling not listened to, not seen or cared about. So there's a very young, wounded place, very quickly accessible. And it expressed, she told me, in daily ways, in shame, self-doubt, and self-judgment, real difficulty feeling close to others, often felt victimized and shut out. And she could sense this casing, this hard armoring around her heart. So there was a lot of mistrust, a lot of anger. So I invited her to get in touch with a recent experience where she was felt really triggered, and the most prominent emotion was self-aversion. So that's where we started, with the waves of self-aversion. And the R of rain is simply to recognize that's there. And the A of rain, let it be there. Let the waves be there. You're not trying to get rid of the waves. You're not trying to ignore the waves. In fact, the real transformation comes when you're just in a wise relationship with the waves. So she recognized and allowed the waves, let them be there. And then we began the I of rain, which was investigate. And I asked her what she was believing when she was caught like this. And she was able to get really deep down, I'm unlovable. That's the belief. And then we moved from the ideas of unlovable into her body. And again, the practice of waking up from thoughts and coming into the senses is crucial for that. And we paid attention to her body and her, because really the heart of investigation is to feel somatically what's going on in our bodies. And she could feel her heart was squeezed. She felt like there were like these straps like squeezing and binding her. And there was a real rawness in the chest. And so part of investigation is to really feel that fully. And then nurturing is to offer real care to that wounded place. And when she tried to nurture, she couldn't. She says, I can't offer myself a message. I can't hold myself. There's nobody here to do it. It just feels too big. And she even tried to reach out and, sense some other compassionate source, but just didn't feel held. So we investigated a little more. And I asked the wounded place, what are you really wanting? Because if you ask that question when you investigate, it helps you to customize the nurturing. And she said, I want my mother to listen to me and to care about me. And when she acknowledged that, when she named that after all those years, it was her mother she still wanted, her vulnerability dropped to even a deeper place. And she began weeping and feeling grief that she would never have a mother that could do that. That was the grief. I'll never have a mother that can do that. And again, feeling it, contacting it, being intimate with that grief. In the heart of that grief is this core longing for some loving presence to embrace her. And I invited her to imagine, what would that be like? Who would it be? What would it be? And it was this kind of warm field of loving, very intimate and close in, that totally was attending to her, seeing her, listening to her, loving her. And I said, what are the words that want to come out from you to that loving presence? And it was really just, please love me, please hold me. And I had her say it a number of times. And the more she did, the more she said she felt this sense of being utterly washed over with loving, held in loving. Now I want to pause here. And I want to make a comment too about nurturing and about accessing compassion. And this is a place that a lot of people say, oh, I can do the RAI of rain, but the nurturing, this is the alchemy of compassion, is the more you touch into the felt sense of the vulnerability, the real vulnerability. For her, it was that grieving. I'll never have the mother I longed for. And the more you really get, this is suffering, this hurts. I use the word ouch. It's like really getting that. In the tenderness of that, in the tenderness of the vulnerability, a natural compassion arises. And often the nurturing doesn't come because we haven't really entered into that vulnerability. But when we do, we become porous. We become more available. but we have to get the ouch. This really hurts. And for this woman, that grieving put her right into it. And the more she could feel bathed in the presence of love, the more there was that kind of dissolving of the armoring. So after some long moments, she just knew she was resting in a larger place. This is after the rain. Something had shifted. And then after the rain, after the 4 steps of rain, I generally say, notice the quality of presence that's here. Rest in that, be that awareness, that presence. And I'll sometimes invite people to, after a while, notice where they were when they started. That for her is that unlovable self, which is being in the cocoon, being caught in the waves, and notice what's here now, this spacious, tender presence. Because the more we get familiar with the shift, the more we get familiar with that spaciousness, the more we know it's the truth. It's more true than any story we could ever tell about ourselves. This is the shift in identity that we're exploring, friends. This is the shift from the waves to the sea that really is the grounds of freedom. And the approach to it in practice is, if you're using rain, and you don't have to call it rain, if you're using mindfulness and compassion, is when you feel more expanded, get to know that experience, get familiar, get a sense of intimacy with what that's like, because it's home, it's who you really are. Okay, we're going to practice in a few moments. But before we do, just to say that we've been exploring how to, the first approach that I mentioned of the two, how to pay attention to the waves and become the ocean. And when we're really landlocked, how do we work with that? And as I mentioned, the other pathway is turning directly to the sea of awareness, which we'll explore together next time. So let's practice. And as we often do, take a moment to adjust your posture so that you're sitting in a way that's really comfortable, relaxed, alert. If it helps you to close your eyes or lower your gaze, bring the attention inward. We start with the words of Rumi. I am water. I am the thorn that catches someone's clothing. There's nothing to believe. Only when I quit believing in myself did I come into this beauty. Day and night I guarded the pearl of my soul. Now, in this ocean of purling currents, I've lost track of which was mine. You might scan your life and sense which are the currents that are reactive currents right now for you, the waves that you get stuck in. You might bring to mind a situation where you feel like you get caught. Perhaps maybe you turn on yourself or turn on another, where there's separation. And when you have a situation in mind, you might want to focus in on it and sense the particular moment when you get most triggered, what's going on. Maybe if it involves someone else, look on their face, what they're saying, or maybe what room you're in, what activity you're doing. This could be anything that triggers you. And pause when you get to the worst part of the experience and take a moment to sense what's most difficult, what's most upsetting. And just notice whatever feelings are strongest right now. It might be anger, hurt, fear, shame, self judgment, jealousy. You start the R of rain recognized by mentally whispering whatever's most predominant, the emotion that's here, the waves that seem the strongest. It might be one emotion or two. The A of rains to allow, and if you can, just to let it be okay, they're here for now, that you're not going to judge them, you're not turning away from them, not trying to fix anything. You can begin investigating by asking yourself, well, what's most upsetting? What's the worst part? What am I afraid of? It's going to happen. To deepen your connection with what's going on. And what am I believing when I get triggered? Are you believing that you're in some way failing, or that another person couldn't be treating you this way if they cared about you? What are you believing? And when you're believing in this way, what's it like in your body? And this is where you move right into the body, the throat, the chest, the belly. And if you put your hand on your heart, you can help to keep more attention in the body. And also, it's the beginning of nurturing. It's never too early to nurture. And just feel and breathe. Breathe and feel. You might sense what's most vulnerable. What's the worst part? Where is it in your body? What's the shape of it? The felt sense of it? You might, as that woman did, inquire and sense, what does this part most want or most need? Does it need to be forgiven? Does it need to be accompanied, understood, seen, loved, held? And sense that you're experiencing this and feeling that vulnerability, but also that there's a witnessing presence that's noticing what's going on, and let yourself, from that most wise heart of yours, begin to offer some nurturing to the part of you that needs it. Sense what's needed, and perhaps there's a message to offer yourself, some reminder. Could be simply, I'm here, I'm not leaving, or I care about this suffering, or trust your goodness. Or if there's fear there, thank you for trying to protect me, but I'm okay right now. Just offer whatever message feels most deeply healing. And you might feel with the touch that you're actually communicating care. And if it's hard to offer to yourself, then, as that woman did, imagine the source that you want to feel loved from. Could be a person that you know, person that's no longer around, friend, a grandmother, could be your dog, Could be a spiritual figure, could be formless, loving awareness, intimately holding, present, tender with you. Whatever the source, let in the loving. Let that at least be your intention, to let that love and care, in whatever form is most healing, bathe the place of vulnerability. Just bathe it. And you might sense what you'd experience, what your life would be like if you no longer believed the belief, if you really believed there was nothing wrong with you. There's nothing wrong. That belief's real but not true, the one you're holding that kept you in the cocoon. Real but not true. And just sense, who would you be without it? Relax and notice the presence that's here. Notice the quality of spaciousness, of awareness, tenderness. Just be that awareness. And you might notice and remember where you started, the sense of a small self triggered, caught in the waves. And this presence, this sea of awareness, knowing this is your true home. Day and night, I guarded the pearl of my soul. Now, in this ocean of purling currents, I've lost track of which was mine. Thank you, friends, for your attention, for exploring together. Wish you all blessings, a deep bow of appreciation. Namaste.